And think about what it had already survived. It made it through the chaotic warlord era in the 1920s. It survived the brutal Japanese occupation of Beijing in the 30s and 40s.
So it made it through actual foreign invasions and wars, only to end up in a backyard fire.
It ended up in a makeshift brick incinerator right there in his courtyard. And Lou's hands are completely stained black with soot. Not from ink, but from the ash of his own 16th century woodblock prints.
He was feeding them into the fire himself. That's just a devastating image.
He spent the entire morning personally feeding his family's history into the flames. Because doing it yourself was the only way to preempt a raid.
Because if the Red Guards found it, the consequences would be severe. It was about survival.
It was an act of desperate cultural suicide. The campaign against the Four Olds was sweeping through the city, and hiding a giant library in a crowded hutong where the walls are paper thin was just physically impossible.
Yeah, your neighbors would definitely know you had it. You couldn't hide something of that volume.
You really couldn't. And if he was caught with it, the political stigma would have destroyed his children and his grandchildren. So he burned it to save his family. For him, the destruction felt total.
And this is where the story completely shifts. Less than 2 miles away from that courtyard, the state is doing something completely different.
It is a jarring contrast. Just a short walk from where Old Man Lou is literally weeping over the ashes of his ancestors, the state's monumental collection of Song Dynasty rarities in the National Library is sitting in perfect climate-controlled silence.
Guarded by the bureaucracy.
Guarded heavily. Let's shift over to the first historical archives in Beijing. Imagine a young People's Liberation Army soldier. We'll call him Chen. It's that same humid summer of 1966.
Okay, so he's stationed right at the gates of the archives.
Right at the heavy iron gates. And his fingers are trembling against the cold steel of his Type 56 carbine. Behind those thick walls are millions of Qing Dynasty imperial records.
And when we say imperial records, we mean like the actual bureaucratic ledger of the empire, right?
We're talking about vermilion-brushed edicts from emperors, grand secretary documents, land tax registries, millions of documents that detail exactly how the Chinese empire functioned day by day.
Which is pretty much the ultimate symbol of the old culture the crowds were trying to destroy.
Exactly. And outside Chen's gate, there is a literal sea of teenagers in red armbands. They are surging forward, chanting slogans, screaming for the Four Olds to be smashed. You can imagine the sheer kinetic energy of that crowd.
It must have been terrifying. So why didn't the military just step aside? Weren't they part of the same revolutionary state?
Chen had very specific, highly classified orders from his commanders. He was explicitly briefed that these archives were strategic assets. They were under the direct protection of the State Council.
So the government drew a hard line. The state data was not considered for olds.
The Red Guards saw ideological poison, but the state saw foundational data that had to be protected at all costs. Chen actually watched through the iron slats at the gate as his own cousin threw a neighbor's genealogy into a fire just 50 yards away.
Wait, his own cousin? That really puts the disconnect into perspective. The personal history burns, but the state's memory is locked inside a fortress.
It was heavily fortified. The destruction was not this blind, chaotic frenzy where the state lost its mind. It was an incredibly surgical, class-based lobotomy.
Surgical was exactly the word. Because it's like, if we think about modern computers, it's like the operating system and the master databases of a huge network were put behind military-grade encryption.
Logic.
But then every single user's personal desktop folders, their family photos, their individual files were just violently and permanently deleted.
Right. The state hoarded the official past while the private past was sacrificed. This highlights the absolute difference between memory and data.
Because memory is emotional, right? It's tied to Old Man Lou's identity.
Exactly. Memory is fragile and decentralized. Data is structural. Data is what the state had, and states require archives for basic governance. The Chinese government showed immense foresight here.
I mean, you can't run a country that massive without knowing where the borders are or who owns what land.
You literally can't. You need those centuries-old property registries, diplomatic treaties, and records of how previous dynasties managed flood control on the Yellow River. The first historical archives in Beijing and the second historical archives in Nanjing were vital organs of the state.
So they weren't protecting it out of some romantic love for history. They were protecting the operating manual for the country.
And because they treated it as classified state secrets, the archive survived perfectly intact. But the tragedy is that a whole generation was left with this hollowed out sense of identity because they they only saw the street-level destruction.
Which leads right into that massive misconception, that pervasive myth that 90% of Chinese history was destroyed. You see that number thrown around everywhere.
But it's mathematically and historically completely baseless. It's an emotional metaphor, not statistical fact.
Because to have a percentage, to know, will have to begin with.
You need a denominator. You'd have to know the exact sum of all historical texts and artifacts existing across all of China on the morning of August 1st, 1966, and no such inventory existed.
So when someone says 90% was destroyed, they're really just projecting Old Man Lu's total personal loss onto the entire nation.
The last of absolute state survival is an error, especially when you look at the physical redundancy of the written word in China.
Right, because they didn't just have one copy of important text, they had massive backup systems. Yeah.
Let's look at the Siku Quanchu, the complete library of the four treasuries. This was compiled in the 18th century under the Qianlong Emperor. It wasn't just a book. It was an encyclopedic compilation of all Chinese literature, history, and philosophy.
How big was it actually?
It was roughly 36,000 volumes, like around 800 million words.
Wow, and this is way before modern printing presses, so it was all hand copied.
All hand copied by an army of over 3,000 scholars. And they didn't just make one set. The imperial court ordered the creation of 7 complete identical sets.
7 sets of 36,000 volumes. That is an insane amount of labor.
Correct. And then they distributed those 7 sets to specially constructed imperial pavilions across the entire geography of the empire. Beijing, Chengde, Shenyang, Hangzhou, Zhenjiang, Yangzhou.
So centuries before the internet or cloud storage, the Chinese state was actively creating decentralized off-site geographic backups of its core database.
You can smash a local server, but the cloud remains.
Yeah.
By the 20th century, these texts had been copied and printed so many times that they were major university and provincial libraries all over the country. Total textual extinction was physically impossible.
It really was a physical possibility. And then you add the direct intervention of the central government on top of that built-in redundancy.
The central leadership, particularly Premier Zhu Online, actively functioned as a protective firewall. He issued specific urgent directive to deploy the PLA to protect key cultural sites.
Like the Forbidden City in Beijing. That's sitting right in the middle of all the chaos. It's huge. How did it not get overrun?
Because Zhu Online ordered the gates of the Forbidden City to be completely sealed. He deployed battalions of the PLA to form a physical perimeter. They were ordered to refuse entry to anyone, period. The military locked down the absolute center of China's imperial history.
And it wasn't just Beijing, right? They did this out in the provinces, too.
Everywhere that had strategic or supreme historical value. Take the Dunhuang Mugao caves out in the Gobi Desert, a millennium of Buddhist murals and statues. Zhu Online signed a direct order placing the caves under the protection of the local military garrison.
What about the Potala Palace in Tibet? We always hear about the destruction of local monasteries there.
The local destruction was devastating, yes. But the Potala Palace, the massive historic residence of the Dalai Lamas, survived because the central government specifically deployed the military to occupy and protect it, sealing it off from the mobs.
So the state was incredibly successful at protecting its official history. If the state saved the archives, the Forbidden City, the Mogao caves, why does everyone still believe everything was lost?
It goes back to what people actually saw. The visual and emotional impact was profound. If you're a villager and you watch your 1,000-year-old local temple being smashed by teenagers with sledgehammers, your entire world is destroyed.
Right. You don't know the Forbidden City is safe. You just know your local shrine is open.
Exactly. To the scholar watching his family's unique manuscripts burn, the loss is absolute. Early assessments of this era were heavily colored by these visible, deeply painful scars on the landscape.
But confusing public access with physical existence is the real error here. The public couldn't see the archives because they were locked down by the military.
For over a decade, the Chinese public had almost no access to their own historical core. They assumed the silence meant destruction. But when the archives finally reopened in the late 1970s and 1980s, the academic world was just floored.
They must have been shocked by how much was still there.
It fueled a massive boom in Chinese historical scholarship. Researchers walked in and found pristine Qing legal codes, Ming administrative documents, centuries of census ledgers. The backbone of the state's data was completely untouched.
Incredible. But, this instinct of the state to hoard and protect its history behind military guards while completely ignoring public access, that it feels like it's not just a 20th century thing.
No, it's not. You're hitting on the bedrock of Chinese historical philosophy. You cannot understand 1966 without looking at how the state interacted with archives throughout Imperial China. It is vastly different from the Western concept of knowledge preservation.
Because in the West, we have this 19th century idea of the public library, right? Like the Peterborough Town Library in 1833, where anyone could just walk in and read a book.
Exactly, driven by Enlightenment ideals of democratic access. But Imperial China never organically developed public libraries. The fundamental purpose of collecting texts was entirely geared toward administrative dominance.
So if there were no public libraries, where did people get books? What were the options?
The options were defined by a strict hierarchy. First, you had the imperial repositories. These were massive collections housed in the palace, completely off limits to the public, exclusive to the emperor and highest officials.
Okay, and the second tier?
Academic collections, like the academies of classical learning. But these were strictly for scholars preparing for the civil service exams. And the third tier was private family collections, like Old Man Lu's ancestors.
But those private collections were basically elite status symbols, right? They weren't exactly open to the neighborhood.
They were notoriously exclusive. Look at the Tianyi Library in Ningbo from the Ming Dynasty. The rules were draconian. Outsiders were absolutely forbidden. If a family member even brought a guest to look at the books, they could be banned from ancestor worship ceremonies.
Wow, so the idea of a library card would be totally alien. These places were vaults of power. Like a central bank holding gold reserves, they held ideological reserves.
That's a brilliant way to phrase it. And the way they organized those reserves tells you everything. The Chinese knowledge classification system evolved into the rigid 4 divisions: classics, history, philosophy, and literary works.
And I assume the classics were at the very top of that hierarchy.
The core Confucian texts were supreme. History was strictly subordinated to the classics. It wasn't objective inquiry, it was a tool to provide examples that validated the current emperor's mandate of heaven.
So the librarians weren't just stamping books. They were official historians and incredibly powerful men.
They were high-ranking Confucian scholar officials. They controlled the flow of historical truth through the written word, specifically the regularized standard script of calligraphy.
Right, because calligraphy wasn't just pretty handwriting, it was the key to the whole bureaucracy.
Mastering that script and understanding the classical text was the only way to pass the civil service exams in the lower class. The written word was an instrument of ideological control, not public enlightenment.
There's actually a really fascinating linguistic detail here with the Chinese character for public, which is gong.
Yes, if you trace gong back to its ancient oracle bone script origins, it doesn't depict a crowd of people. It originally depicted the temple or palace square. It inherited affairs pertaining to the state or the emperor.
So a public library in the imperial context would literally mean a state library.
An institution entirely geared toward consolidating state power. The state held an absolute monopoly on high culture, and that centralization is what ensured the text survived extreme political stress.
Because the state prioritized administrative continuity over individual access, so the PLA guarding the archives in 1966 was just a modern version of a 3,000-year-old tradition.
They were fiercely protecting their own ledger. The tragedy of a private library's burning was a byproduct of this ancient divide between protected state data and vulnerable grassroots traditions.
And that relentless drive to protect the state's ledger extended way beyond the mainland. Which brings us to what has to be one of the most unbelievable logistical feats in human history: the global repository and the migration of history.
It really is unparalleled. Let's travel geographically to understand the scale. Let's go deep into the hewn limestone tunnels of Wufang in Taichung, Taiwan. It's the 1950s.
Okay, so we're in the 1950s.
Carefully prise open a wooden crate number 211. And inside, resting in the stale cedar and camphor air, is the Mao Gong Ding, a nearly 3,000-year-old bronze vessel.
It's just wild to picture that. A 3,000-year-old imperial bronze sitting in a limestone tunnel on a subtropical island, while the mainland is completely convulsing.
Lynn was part of the silent, highly dedicated overseas rear guard. They felt this profound dislocation, knowing the beating heart of ancient China was hiding in a cave. But this wasn't some panicked last-minute flight. It was an epic, decades-long institutional insurance policy.
Because this journey actually started way back in 1933, right? Long before the Cultural Revolution.
Yes, it started with the looming threat of the Japanese invasion. When the Kwantan Army occupied Manchuria, the directors of the National Palace Museum in Beijing knew they had to protect the national treasures.
So they decided to pack up the Forbidden City. How do you even begin to pack ancient paper-thin Song Dynasty porcelain for a journey like that?
With incredible ingenuity, they consulted antique dealers, used immense quantities of cotton, thick handmade paper, and thousands of bundles of straw. They packed the artifacts into 13,427 custom-made heavy wooden crates bound with iron.
13,000 crates, and they moved them out secretly.
Under the cover of darkness, on secured trains south to Shanghai, hoping the foreign concessions would be safe. But by 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident triggered full-scale war. Shanghai and Nanjing were about to fall.
So they had to move this massive collection again, but this time across an active, brutal war zone.
Yes, they divided the crates into 3 separate batches, a southern, a central, and a northern route, and sent them across the vast interior of China to avoid the Japanese bombing.
I mean, moving the equivalent of the Louvre and the Vatican archives on dirt roads and riverboats, the logistics are just staggering.
It was harrowing. The northern route had to cross the icy, treacherous Quinling Mountains in the dead of winter. Season relied on unmodified boats navigating the terrifying rapids of the Yangtze River.
Under constant threat of air raids.
Museum staff literally rode on top of the crates, covering them with tarps during bombings, prioritizing the artifacts over their own lives. They endured freezing snow and tropical rain.
And after all of that, what was the loss rate?
Out of the 13,000 crates, they didn't lose a single vital piece. The damage rate was infinitesimally small. It completely shatters the idea that Chinese culture was ever truly erased. It was protected with a ferocity that's hard to overstate. It just migrated.
And then, after the war with Japan, the Civil War intensifies, leading to the final move to Taiwan.
Yes. By late 1948, the nationalist government, the ROC, realized the mainland was fallen. They evacuated the absolute most important Tier 1 pieces across the Taiwan Strait on naval vessels and retrofitted merchant ships.
Which is how Clerk Lin ends up in the caves in Wufeng, the Beiyou legacy.
But for 15 years in Beiyou, despite the tropical humidity and typhoons, officials worked tirelessly to catalog every item. They held the line until the Modern National Chemist Museum was built in Taipei in 1965.
They basically created an invincible cultural life raft. And beyond Taiwan, there's also the massive international redundancy of Chinese history.
Absolutely. Vast quantities of manuscripts and art are sitting in the Library of Congress, the British Library, and institutions in Japan like the Sekadu Book. The global backups were secure.
So even if the absolute worst had happened in Beijing, the data of the civilization was already distributed globally.
History didn't disappear. It waited patiently in the shadows. Both the PRC government successfully deploying the military to guard the Beijing archives, and the ROC government moving crates across war zones, demonstrated an unparalleled institutional commitment to keeping the continuous thread of civilization unbroken.
The historical ledger of China reveals a profound truth about the survival of civilization. The visceral, deeply felt destruction of family genealogies and neighborhood temples left an undeniable psychological scar, creating the illusion of a total cultural erasure. Yet the data itself, the cold, clinical, highly guarded archives of the state, endured perfectly intact. It suggests a striking irony about human heritage. The very bureaucratic detachment and state centralization that often alienates the individual is precisely the mechanism that insulates a civilization's core data from the turbulent passions of its own people. While memory is fragile and easily consumed by the flames of the present, the vault of history, guarded by the silent architecture of the state, quietly outlasts the fire.
Confirmed. Scored a critical hit.
Give him everything you've got. Waiting for orders. Coordinates received. All weapons are go! Want some more, huh? Shutting melting down! My mech can't take the heat!
Damage minimal. Warning, armor low. Engaging multiple targets.
Ready for orders. Move into position. Hostile removed.
Waiting for orders. Mech warriors, show them what you've got. What can I do for you? Ready to go.
I'm here. Position confirmed.
Yes, Commander. Got it. No shooting, just running.
Warning, Armor low.
Good to go. Firing everything I've got. Gotcha! All out of LRMs, Commander. Took a heavy hit there.
Engaging multiple targets.
I'm taking internal damage.
Commander. Acknowledged. Black on AC-10 ammo.
Standing by. I copy. Think I hit something good. Okay, now it's on. Commander? Moving fast. This is trouble. This isn't looking too good.
I'm showing minor damage.
Engaging multiple targets.
Enemy mech. Critical damage detected.
Standing by. On my way. Hostile eliminated.
Good to go. Aye, aye. Taking the shot. Target eliminated. I'm taking heat. Hell yeah. I lost a weapon. Good to go. My internals are taking a beating.
Waiting for orders.
Yes, Commander. On the move. Rear armor mech destroyed. Shutting down. My heat gauge is pegged. Let's hit him hard. Waiting for orders.
Aye, aye. Heading out. Putting my weight into it.
Commander? Affirmative.
Long-range missiles depleted.
Confirmed. Oh!
Good to go. Coordinates received. Ah! Enemy down.